The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists gathered in thick crowds, their cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Margaret Whitmore, a woman in her late 40s wearing designer sunglasses and an expensive cream-colored coat. She checked her reflection in her phone screen, adjusting her perfectly styled blonde hair before turning her attention to the guards standing at their posts. Margaret had arrived in London 3 days ago for what she called a luxury vacation. Back home in Chicago, she owned a successful real estate company and never missed an opportunity to remind people of her achievements. Her social media was filled with photos of expensive restaurants, first-class flights, and 5-star hotels. This trip to London was no different. She had already posted dozens of pictures, each one carefully filtered and captioned with phrases about living her best life. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony time approached. Margaret pushed her way to the front, not bothering to excuse herself as she elbowed past families with children and elderly couples who had been waiting patiently. A young mother with a stroller gave her an annoyed look, but Margaret ignored it completely. She was used to getting what she wanted, and a few disapproving glances had never stopped her before. Standing directly in front of one of the guards, Margaret pulled out her phone. The guard, a tall man in his 20s named James Hartley, stood perfectly still in his red tunic and bearskin hat. His face showed no emotion, his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. He had been serving in the Coldstream Guards for 3 years and had learned to ignore the tourists who sometimes tried to make him laugh or react. Margaret snapped several selfies with James in the background. She examined each photo critically, deleting the ones where her smile looked forced or the lighting was unflattering. Unsatisfied with the distance, she stepped closer, crossing the clearly marked boundary line that tourists were meant to respect. A nearby police officer noticed and started moving in her direction, but Margaret was already focused entirely on getting the perfect shot. She moved even closer to James, now standing just inches from him. Other tourists began to whisper and point. Some looked uncomfortable, sensing that she was doing something inappropriate. A teenage boy with his father said something about respecting the guards, but his father shushed him, not wanting to cause a scene. Margaret heard none of this. She was too busy angling her phone, trying different poses, completely absorbed in her own little world. The police officer called out a warning. Margaret waved her hand dismissively without even looking at him. She had paid good money to come to London, she thought, and she deserved to get the photo she wanted. Rules were for other people, for those who did not understand how to make the most of life. She had always believed that confidence and determination could overcome any obstacle, and this situation was no different. James remained motionless. His training had prepared him for this. Tourists often got too close, and he knew how to handle it professionally. He had seen people try to make him laugh, stand directly in his path, and even attempt to touch his uniform. This woman was behaving badly, but he had dealt with worse. The key was to maintain composure and let the police handle the situation. Margaret decided the photos still were not good enough. She wanted something more dramatic, more unique. Something that would get hundreds of likes on her social media. She noticed that James held his rifle in front of him, and an idea formed in her mind. If she could get a photo where it looked like she was part of the guard ceremony somehow, that would be perfect. That would show everyone back home how bold and adventurous she was. She reached out and placed her hand on James's shoulder. The crowd gasped. Several people shouted at her to stop. The police officer began moving faster through the crowd, speaking urgently into his radio. But Margaret was already committed to her plan. She leaned in closer, trying to position herself as if she were standing at attention beside James, ready for her perfect photograph. James felt her hand on his uniform. This was a clear violation, one that he could not ignore. Protocol was specific about physical contact. He had been trained for this exact scenario, though he had never expected to actually need to use that training. His jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign of his reaction. But he remained in position. Margaret's friend, another American tourist named Brenda who had been watching from a few feet away, finally called out to her. Brenda had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with Margaret's behavior throughout the trip. This was the 3rd time in as many days that Margaret had done something embarrassing. At the Tower of London, she had argued with a staff member about not being allowed to touch the crown jewels. At a fancy restaurant in Mayfair, She had sent back her meal 3 times and left without tipping. Brenda was beginning to regret agreeing to this vacation, but Margaret did not hear her friend. She was posing now, her hand still on James's shoulder, her face arranged in what she thought was a sophisticated smile. She had no idea that dozens of people were recording her on their phones. She had no idea that the police officer was now just seconds away. She had no idea that in just a moment everything was about to change. She simply held her pose, waiting for Brenda to take the photo, completely confident that she was creating a memorable moment that everyone would admire. The crowd had grown silent. Even the excited chatter of children had stopped. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Some tourists looked angry, others looked shocked, and a few looked almost frightened. They all understood that this woman had crossed a line, that she was disrespecting not just a guard but a tradition that the British people held dear. The tension in the air was thick and heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. James made his decision in a split second. His training took over, and he executed a movement that every guard practices but hopes never to use on a civilian. With sharp precision, he stamped his right foot down hard against the cobblestones. The sound echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. Then, in one fluid motion, he brought his rifle around in a ceremonial defensive position and shouted in a voice that carried to every corner of the plaza. The words he used were traditional, a formal warning that had been employed by royal guards for generations. His voice was not angry, but it was powerful and commanding in a way that made everyone within hearing distance freeze in place. The volume and authority behind those words were shocking, especially coming from someone who had been standing in perfect silence just moments before. Margaret stumbled backward, her phone slipping from her hands and clattering on the ground. Her face went pale, then flushed red with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. She had expected perhaps a quiet word from security, maybe a polite request to step back. She had not expected this. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this. In her world of business meetings and social events, people treated her with deference and respect. This public reprimand in front of hundreds of people was completely outside her experience. The crowd erupted. Some people applauded, clearly satisfied that the disrespectful tourist had been put in her place. Others pulled out their phones to record what had just happened, sensing that this moment would soon be viral on social media. Children asked their parents questions about why the guard had shouted. A few tourists near Margaret took several steps back, as if her disgrace might somehow be contagious. Brenda hurried forward and grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her friend away from the guard post. Margaret allowed herself to be led, too stunned to resist. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. She bent to retrieve her phone, her hands shaking as she picked it up and saw that the screen had cracked when it hit the ground. Even this small additional disaster seemed to overwhelm her. The police officer who had been rushing toward the scene slowed his approach. James had handled the situation perfectly, and there was no need for the officer to intervene further. However, he still approached Margaret and Brenda, his expression serious. He explained in clear terms that touching the guards was strictly forbidden, that boundaries existed for important reasons, and that Margaret was fortunate not to be facing more serious consequences. His tone was professional but firm, leaving no room for argument. Margaret tried to defend herself. She started to say something about being a tourist, about not knowing the rules, about how she had meant no harm, but her voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to her own ears. The police officer listened politely, then simply repeated his warning and suggested that she move along. Other officers had appeared now, forming a subtle barrier between Margaret and the guard post, making it clear that she was not welcome to remain in that area. Brenda pulled Margaret away, guiding her through the crowd of onlookers. People stared as they passed. Some made comments, not bothering to lower their voices. Margaret heard snippets of conversation, words like disrespectful, entitled, and typical. Each comment felt like a small knife. She was used to being talked about, but always in tones of admiration or envy. This open contempt was a new and horrible experience. They found a bench in a quieter area of the palace grounds. Margaret sat down heavily, still clutching her cracked phone. Brenda sat beside her, not quite sure what to say. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and heavy. Finally, Brenda spoke, her voice gentle but honest. She told Margaret that what had just happened was entirely preventable, that the rules were clearly posted, that the guards were doing their jobs and deserved respect. Margaret wanted to argue. She wanted to say that she had been treated unfairly, that the guard had overreacted, that everyone was making too big a deal out of a simple mistake, but the words would not come. Deep down, in a place she rarely allowed herself to examine, she knew that Brenda was right. She had been so focused on getting what she wanted, on creating the perfect image for social media, that she had completely disregarded everyone around her. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly ashamed. It was not just the embarrassment of being called out in public, though that certainly stung. It was something deeper, a growing realization that her behavior had been genuinely wrong. She thought about the other tourists who had been patiently waiting, about the families she had pushed past, about the young guard who was just doing his duty and whom she had treated as nothing more than a prop for her photograph. Brenda checked the time and suggested they head back to their hotel. Margaret nodded numbly. As they stood to leave, a young woman approached them. She was in her early 20s with kind eyes and a slight accent that suggested she was from somewhere in Europe. She spoke softly, saying that she had witnessed what happened and wanted Margaret to know that many tourists make mistakes in London. She shared a story about her own first visit years ago when she had accidentally done something similar at Windsor Castle and had learned an important lesson about respecting traditions and protocols. The young woman's kindness was unexpected, and Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. She thanked the woman, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled, squeezed Margaret's hand briefly, and then walked away, disappearing back into the crowd of tourists. That small gesture of compassion, coming right after such a harsh lesson, affected Margaret more deeply than she would have thought possible. As they walked back toward their hotel, Margaret replayed the incident in her mind. She saw herself through the eyes of all those watching tourists, through the eyes of the guard she had touched, through the eyes of her friend Brenda, who had witnessed her increasingly difficult behavior throughout their trip. The image that emerged was not flattering. She saw someone arrogant and self-centered, someone who believed rules did not apply to her, someone who had forgotten basic courtesy and respect. The streets of London passed by in a blur. Margaret barely noticed the beautiful architecture, the bustling shops, the red buses that tourists found so charming. Her mind was too occupied with uncomfortable thoughts and unwelcome realizations. She had built her entire life around the idea that confidence and determination were virtues, that pushing forward and taking what you wanted was the key to success. But now she wondered if somewhere along the way, she had crossed a line from confidence into arrogance, from determination into disrespect. Back at the hotel, Margaret went straight to her room without stopping at the bar where they had planned to have lunch. Brenda followed her up, concerned about her friend despite her frustration with Margaret's recent behavior. Margaret sat on the edge of the perfectly made hotel bed and stared at her cracked phone screen. She unlocked it and opened her social media apps, something she usually did dozens of times a day. Her most recent post was from that morning, a selfie taken at breakfast with a caption about embracing adventure and living fearlessly. The photo showed her smiling confidently, looking polished and successful. Now, just a few hours later, that image felt false and hollow. She wondered how many of her followers would see the videos that were probably already circulating online. She wondered what they would think of her then. Brenda sat in the chair by the window and looked at her friend with a mixture of sympathy and concern. She had known Margaret for 15 years, ever since they had met at a business conference in Dallas. Back then, Margaret had been driven and ambitious, but also warm and funny. Somewhere over the years, success had changed her. The warmth had been replaced by a sharp edge. The humor had given way to constant self-promotion. Brenda had watched this transformation with growing worry, but had never found the right moment to address it. Margaret finally broke the silence. She asked Brenda if she thought the incident would end up online. Brenda hesitated, then gently told her that several people had been recording, so it was quite possible. Margaret closed her eyes and took a shaky breath. She had always carefully curated her online presence, controlling every image and message. The thought of a video showing her at her worst being publicly corrected and humiliated was almost unbearable. But Brenda said something that surprised Margaret. She pointed out that maybe this was an opportunity, not a disaster. Maybe this was a chance for Margaret to show people something real, something honest. Maybe instead of hiding from what happened, she could acknowledge it and learn from it. The suggestion hung in the air between them, radical in its simplicity. Margaret had never apologized publicly for anything. Her business philosophy had always been to project strength and certainty, to never show weakness or admit mistakes. The idea of voluntarily sharing her embarrassment went against every instinct she had developed over years of climbing the corporate ladder. But something about Brenda's words resonated with her. Something about them felt true in a way that her usual approach no longer did. That evening, Margaret stayed in her room while Brenda went out to explore the city. She ordered room service but barely touched the food. Instead, she sat by the window watching the lights of London come alive as darkness fell. She thought about her life back in Chicago, about her beautiful but empty apartment, about her successful but ultimately shallow business relationships, about all the people she had pushed aside or dismissed in her pursuit of success. She thought about her ex-husband, Tom, who had left her 5 years ago. He had said she had become someone he did not recognize, someone who cared more about status than about people. At the time, she had been furious with him, had blamed him for not supporting her ambitions. But now, sitting alone in a hotel room in a foreign country, she wondered if he had been trying to tell her something important, something she had refused to hear. She thought about her daughter, Emily, who was now 23 and living in Seattle. They spoke maybe once a month, brief and awkward conversations that never went beyond surface pleasantries. Emily had stopped coming home for holidays 2 years ago, always citing work obligations or travel plans. Margaret had told herself that Emily was simply busy building her own life, but deep down she knew there was more to it than that. She knew that Emily had grown tired of competing for attention with her mother's phone, tired of every family gathering turning into a photo opportunity for social media. Margaret picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She stopped at Emily's name, her finger hovering over the call button. What would she even say? How could she explain what had happened today and why it mattered? How could she admit that she was beginning to see herself clearly, for perhaps the first time in years? The conversation felt too big, too difficult. She put the phone down without calling. Instead, she opened her laptop and searched for videos of the incident. It took less than 30 seconds to find the first one. The title was sensational, calling her a rude American tourist who got what she deserved. Margaret's stomach clenched as she clicked play. Watching herself on screen was excruciating. She saw how aggressively she had pushed through the crowd, how dismissive she had been of the police officer's warning, how entitled she had looked as she posed with her hand on the guard's shoulder. But what struck her most was the expression on her own face just before the guard reacted. She looked smug, self-satisfied, completely oblivious to how her behavior was affecting everyone around her. She looked like someone who believed the world existed for her entertainment and convenience. She looked, she realized with a sinking feeling, like someone she would not want to be friends with. The comments below the video were harsh. People called her names, made assumptions about her character, expressed satisfaction that she had been embarrassed. A few comments were sympathetic, suggesting that everyone makes mistakes, but these were vastly outnumbered by the negative responses. Margaret read through them, forcing herself not to look away, making herself see how strangers perceived her actions. One comment in particular caught her attention. A woman had written about her own brother, who served as a ceremonial guard in another country. She explained how seriously these guards took their duty, how much training and discipline was required, how disrespectful it was to treat them as tourist attractions, rather than as military personnel performing important service. The comment was not angry, just sad and disappointed. Somehow that made it worse. Margaret closed the laptop and walked to the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror, really looked, in a way she had not done in years. She saw the expensive haircut and perfect makeup, the designer clothes and confident posture. But she also saw something else now, something she had been avoiding. She saw loneliness. She saw someone who had confused being admired with being liked, who had mistaken attention for connection. She washed her face, removing the carefully applied makeup. Without it, she looked older, more vulnerable. She looked like a real person with real flaws, not like the polished image she presented to the world. She stood there for a long time, studying this more honest version of herself, wondering if it was too late to become someone better, someone her daughter might want to talk to, someone her ex-husband might have stayed with, someone who could make a real friend instead of just a business contact. A text message from Brenda interrupted her thoughts. Her friend had gone to a pub and met some friendly locals who were sharing stories about London history. She invited Margaret to join them, saying that the walk and fresh air might do her good. Margaret looked at the message for a long moment. Her instinct was to decline, to hide in her room and lick her wounds. But she thought about what Brenda had said earlier, about this being an opportunity rather than just a disaster. Margaret changed into casual clothes, something comfortable rather than fashionable. She grabbed her coat and headed downstairs, following the directions Brenda had texted. The pub was only a few blocks from the hotel, tucked down a narrow street lined with old buildings. Warm light spilled from its windows, and she could hear laughter and conversation from inside. For a moment she hesitated at the door, feeling nervous in a way she had not felt in years. Inside, Brenda waved from a corner table where she sat with 3 other people. Margaret made her way over, feeling self-conscious without her usual armor of perfect hair and makeup. Brenda introduced her to Robert, a retired teacher in his 60s, Sarah, a nurse in her 30s, and David, a university student studying history. They greeted her warmly, and Robert pulled over an extra chair. The conversation was relaxed and genuine. They were discussing London landmarks and sharing recommendations for places to visit. Margaret found herself just listening at first, not sure how to participate in a conversation that was not about business deals or social status. But gradually she began to relax. These people were not trying to impress anyone. They were just enjoying each other's company and sharing their love of their city. David mentioned Buckingham Palace and asked if they had seen the changing of the guard. Margaret felt her face grow hot. Before she could decide how to respond, Brenda jumped in and said they had been there that morning. She gave Margaret a meaningful look, and Margaret understood that her friend was giving her a choice. She could remain silent and let the moment pass, or she could be honest about what had happened. Margaret took a deep breath and made a decision. She told them that yes, she had been there, and that she had done something stupid. The words came slowly at first, but then faster as she described the incident. She did not try to make excuses or minimize what she had done. She simply told the truth about her behavior and about how the guard had responded. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Robert started laughing, not unkindly, but with genuine amusement. He said that those guards took their duty very seriously, and that she had learned an important lesson about British military tradition. Sarah added that she had seen tourists make similar mistakes and that the important thing was to learn from it. David, who had been studying British military history, explained some of the background about the guards and their role, helping Margaret understand why her actions had been such a serious breach of protocol. What surprised Margaret most was that none of them judged her harshly. They acknowledged that she had made a mistake, but they also gave her credit for being willing to talk about it honestly. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Margaret felt something shift inside her. These strangers had shown her more grace and understanding than she had shown to countless people over the years. They had treated her with kindness despite her confession, something she rarely did for others when they disappointed her. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation. Robert told funny stories about his years teaching history to teenagers. Sarah shared experiences from working in a busy London hospital. David talked passionately about his studies and his dreams of becoming a museum curator. Margaret realized she could not remember the last time she had sat and listened to people talk about their lives without immediately trying to turn the conversation back to herself or her achievements. When it was her turn to share, Margaret found herself talking not about her business success, but about her daughter Emily. She admitted that their relationship had become distant and that she blamed herself for prioritizing work over family. The words came out before she could stop them, vulnerabilities she had never shared even with close friends. But the people at the table listened with compassion, and Sarah shared her own struggles with balancing career and family. The evening ended with exchanged contact information and promises to stay in touch. As Margaret and Brenda walked back to the hotel, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. Brenda commented that she seemed different, more like the person she had been when they first met. Margaret smiled and said she was trying to figure out who she wanted to be, and that today's embarrassment might have been exactly what she needed. That night, Margaret could not sleep. Her mind was too active, processing everything that had happened and everything she had realized. She got up and opened her laptop again. She looked at her social media accounts, at the carefully constructed image she had built over the years. It all seemed fake now, a performance that had cost her more than she had gained. She began typing a post, something she had never done before. She did not use filters or perfect lighting for the accompanying photo. Instead, she used a simple picture Brenda had taken of her at the pub, looking relaxed and natural. In the post, she wrote about what had happened at Buckingham Palace. She described her behavior honestly, without trying to justify it or make excuses. She wrote about the lessons she had learned, about respect and humility and the importance of recognizing that the world does not revolve around any one person. She wrote about how easy it had been to lose sight of basic decency in the pursuit of the perfect image, the perfect moment, the perfect life. She wrote about how a stern rebuke from a royal guard had forced her to examine herself in a way she had been avoiding for years. She wrote about how embarrassed she was, but also how grateful she felt for the wake-up call. Before she could second-guess herself, she hit post. Then she closed the laptop and lay back down, her heart pounding. She had just made herself vulnerable to thousands of followers who were used to seeing her as confident and unshakable. She had admitted to a very public mistake and to deeper personal failings. It went against everything she had believed about maintaining a professional image. The next morning, Margaret woke to dozens of notifications. With trembling hands, she opened her phone and began reading the responses to her post. What she found surprised her. Yes, there were some negative comments. People who enjoyed watching someone successful be taken down a notch. But there were far more positive responses than she had expected. People thanked her for her honesty. They shared their own stories of making mistakes and learning from them. They appreciated seeing someone successful admit to being flawed and human. Several people wrote that her honest post had affected them more deeply than any of her previous polished content ever had. A few people even said that her willingness to be vulnerable had inspired them to examine their own behavior. One message in particular caught her attention. It was from a woman named Jennifer, who wrote that she had been following Margaret for years, envying her seemingly perfect life. But this post, Jennifer wrote, had done something unexpected. It had made Margaret seem real and relatable for the first time. Jennifer thanked her for the reminder that everyone makes mistakes, and that growth comes from admitting them rather than hiding them. Margaret spent the next few days of her London trip doing things differently. Instead of rushing from one famous landmark to another just to take photos, she slowed down and actually experienced the city. She visited small museums that were not particularly famous but were full of fascinating stories. She spent an entire afternoon in a second-hand bookshop in Notting Hill, talking with the owner about literature and life. She ate at local cafes instead of expensive restaurants, chatting with servers and other customers. Brenda noticed the change immediately and commented on it several times. Margaret seemed more present, more interested in the world around her rather than just in how the world perceived her. They had deeper conversations during this trip than they had in years. Brenda shared things about her own life that she had never mentioned before, her worries about her aging parents, her fears about her job security, her hopes for the future. In the past, Margaret would have listened with half an ear while checking her phone. Now she gave Brenda her full attention. One afternoon, they took a walking tour of East London led by a guide named Marcus who had grown up in the area. He showed them street art, told them about local history, and introduced them to shop owners and community leaders. Margaret found herself fascinated by the stories of ordinary people who had built extraordinary lives through kindness, perseverance, and community connection. These were not people with millions of followers or luxury lifestyles, but they seemed genuinely content and fulfilled. After the tour, Margaret asked Marcus if she could buy him coffee and ask him some questions. He agreed, curious about what this American tourist wanted to know. They sat in a small cafe, and Margaret asked him how he had found his purpose in life, how he had decided what mattered most to him. Marcus seemed surprised by the depth of the question but gave it serious thought. He told her about hitting rock bottom in his 20s, struggling with addiction, and feeling completely lost. What had saved him, he said, was rediscovering his love for his community and finding ways to serve others. He had started volunteering, then doing free tours for local schools, then eventually building it into a business that allowed him to share his passion while supporting himself. The key, he said, was shifting his focus from what he could get from life to what he could give. His words resonated deeply with Margaret. She realized that for years she had been operating under the opposite philosophy. She had focused entirely on accumulation, on building wealth and status and social media followers. She had measured her worth by external markers of success rather than by internal measures of character and contribution. The conversation with Marcus lasted over 2 hours, and by the end of it, Margaret felt like she had learned more about life than she had in the previous decade. That evening, Margaret did something she had been putting off. She called Emily. Her daughter answered on the 4th ring, sounding surprised to hear from her. There was an awkward moment of silence after they exchanged basic greetings. Then Margaret took a deep breath and told Emily that she wanted to apologize. She apologized for being absent even when she was present, for always being distracted by work or her phone. She apologized for turning family gatherings into photo opportunities instead of genuine connections. She apologized for competing with Emily instead of supporting her, for giving advice when Emily needed understanding. She told Emily about what had happened at Buckingham Palace and about how it had forced her to see herself clearly. Emily was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. She said she had given up hope that her mother would ever change, that she had accepted that their relationship would always be shallow and disappointing. She admitted that she had been avoiding coming home not because she was busy, but because it hurt too much to be around someone who seemed to care more about appearances than about real connection. The conversation that followed was difficult and emotional. Emily shared years of accumulated hurt and frustration. Margaret listened without defending herself or making excuses. She simply acknowledged Emily's feelings and took responsibility for her part in damaging their relationship. It was one of the hardest conversations Margaret had ever had, but also one of the most important. By the end of the call, they had not solved everything. Years of distance could not be bridged in one conversation, but they had made a start. Emily agreed to think about visiting Chicago for Thanksgiving, something she had not done in 3 years. She also admitted that she was impressed by her mother's honesty and willingness to change. She said she wanted to believe it was real and lasting, but that she would need to see sustained effort over time. After hanging up, Margaret cried, really cried, for the first time in years. She cried for the time she had wasted, for the relationship she had damaged, for the person she had become, but she also felt a strange sense of relief. The armor she had been wearing was heavy, and taking it off was painful but also freeing. She was beginning to understand that being vulnerable was not the same as being weak. The final day in London arrived too quickly. Margaret and Brenda packed their bags and prepared to return to America. But before they left, Margaret insisted on making one more stop. She wanted to go back to Buckingham Palace. Brenda was hesitant, worried that it would be too painful or embarrassing. But Margaret explained that she needed to do this. They arrived at the palace mid-morning. The crowds were thick again. Tourists from around the world gathered to witness the ceremony. Margaret stood at a respectful distance this time, well behind the boundary lines. She watched the guards perform their duties with precision and dignity. She thought about the guard who had corrected her, about how he had simply been doing his job, upholding a tradition and maintaining the standards expected of him. When the ceremony concluded, Margaret approached one of the police officers on duty. She identified herself as the woman who had caused a disturbance a few days earlier. The officer looked surprised but listened as Margaret explained that she wanted to formally apologize to the guard, if that was possible. The officer said he could not make any promises but would pass along the message. Margaret thanked him and turned to leave. But as she did, she noticed a tall man in civilian clothes walking across the courtyard. Something about his bearing and posture seemed familiar. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw a flicker of recognition in his face. It was James, the guard she had touched, now off duty and heading somewhere in regular clothes. Margaret felt her heart race. Part of her wanted to hurry away, to avoid further embarrassment. But she remembered her conversation with Emily, her promise to do better, to be braver. She took a breath and walked toward him. James paused, clearly uncertain about this interaction. Margaret stopped a respectful distance away and spoke quietly. She introduced herself, though of course he knew exactly who she was. She said she wanted to apologize directly for her behavior. She explained that she had been thoughtless and disrespectful, treating him like a prop instead of a person. violating his space and undermining his dignity. She said she understood if he could not forgive her, but that she wanted him to know she was genuinely sorry, and that his reaction had taught her an important lesson. James studied her face carefully, perhaps looking for signs that this was some kind of publicity stunt or insincere gesture. But whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. His expression softened slightly and he nodded. He said that he appreciated her apology and that it took courage to come back and face him directly. He explained that tourists often failed to understand that the guards were real soldiers, not actors or statues, and that they deserved the same respect as any military personnel. He told her that he had been serving for 3 years and had dealt with many difficult situations, but that physical contact crossed a clear line that required a firm response. It was nothing personal, he said. It was about maintaining the dignity and security of the position. Margaret listened carefully, understanding now what she had failed to grasp before. These traditions were not just tourist attractions. They represented centuries of service, duty, and sacrifice. James said something that surprised her. He mentioned that he had heard about her social media post, that someone had shown it to him. He said that very few people ever came back to apologize, and even fewer did so publicly. He respected that she had owned her mistake rather than trying to hide from it. His words were simple and direct, without any flowery language or dramatic gestures, but they meant more to Margaret than all the likes and comments she had ever received online. They talked for a few more minutes. James shared a bit about his own journey, how he had joined the military to find direction in his life after struggling in school. He talked about the pride he felt in serving and the importance of discipline and respect. Margaret found herself genuinely interested, asking questions not to be polite but because she truly wanted to understand his perspective. When they finally parted ways, they shook hands, and Margaret felt a sense of closure that she had not expected to find. Brenda had watched the entire interaction from a distance, giving Margaret space but staying close enough to provide support if needed. As they walked away from the palace together, Brenda squeezed Margaret's arm and told her how proud she was. Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It was a different kind of pride than she was used to, not based on achievements or status, but on doing the right thing even when it was difficult. The flight home was long, giving Margaret plenty of time to think about everything that had happened. She thought about how one moment of carelessness had led to public humiliation, which had led to deep self-reflection, which had led to genuine change. She wondered if she would have ever examined her behavior if the guard had not confronted her so forcefully. Probably not, she admitted to herself. She had been so comfortable in her bubble of success and self-importance that nothing less than a dramatic wake-up call would have penetrated. She thought about the people she had met during the trip. Robert, Sarah, and David at the pub, who had shown her kindness despite her confession. Marcus, the tour guide, who had shared his philosophy of service over accumulation. James, the guard, who had maintained his dignity while also showing grace when she apologized. Each of them had contributed something important to her transformation. When Margaret arrived back in Chicago, she felt like she was returning as a different person. Her apartment looked the same, but she saw it through new eyes. It was beautiful and expensive, but it felt cold and impersonal. There were no photos of loved ones, no mementos that told stories, nothing that spoke of real connection or meaning. It was a showcase, not a home. She decided that needed to change. Over the following weeks, Margaret made changes to her life. Some were small, like putting her phone away during meals and actually talking to servers and baristas instead of treating them as invisible. Some were larger, like restructuring her business to spend less time on social media marketing and more time on genuinely helping her clients. She started volunteering at a local community center, teaching business skills to people trying to start their own small companies. The most important change was in her relationships. She called Emily every week, not with an agenda or advice, but just to listen and connect. She invited Brenda over for dinners where they cooked together and talked about real things instead of just meeting at fancy restaurants for brief, superficial catch-ups. She reached out to old friends she had let drift away, apologizing for her absence and asking if they would be willing to rebuild those connections. Not everyone responded positively. Some people were skeptical of her transformation, wondering if it was just another phase or performance. Some of her business associates did not understand why she was pulling back from certain opportunities or changing her approach. A few people on social media criticized her for being fake or attention-seeking, even in her apology. Margaret found these responses painful, but she also understood them. She had spent years building a certain reputation, and it would take time to prove that her change was real and lasting. Her social media presence changed dramatically. Instead of perfectly curated photos and motivational quotes, she shared more honest content about her struggles and growth. She wrote about the challenge of breaking old habits and the discomfort of confronting her own flaws. Her follower count actually decreased at first as people who had been there for the glossy image drifted away. But new followers appeared, people who resonated with her authenticity and vulnerability. 6 months after the London trip, Emily came to visit for Thanksgiving as promised. Margaret had spent days preparing not just the meal but also herself emotionally. She was determined not to fall back into old patterns, not to dominate conversations or turn the visit into a photo opportunity. When Emily arrived, there was still some tension, some hesitation. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But as the weekend progressed, Margaret could feel the walls between them starting to come down. They cooked together, laughed together, and had honest conversations about difficult topics. Emily shared details about her life in Seattle, her work as a graphic designer, her new relationship with a man named Alex, her fears and hopes for the future. Margaret listened without judgment or unsolicited advice, asking questions and showing genuine interest. On the last evening of the visit, Emily brought up the Buckingham Palace incident. She said she had watched the video online after their phone call from London. Margaret tensed, expecting criticism or mockery. But Emily said something unexpected. She said that watching the video had been hard because she recognized the behavior, the entitlement and self-absorption that had characterized so much of their relationship. But she also said that the fact that her mother had been willing to confront it and change gave Emily hope that they could have a real relationship going forward. Emily also shared that the video and Margaret's response to it had affected her own life. She admitted that she had seen some of her mother's worst traits reflected in herself, particularly in her relationship with Alex. She had been taking him for granted, being dismissive of his feelings, prioritizing her own needs and wants. Seeing her mother's transformation had inspired Emily to examine her own behavior and make changes. In a strange way, Emily said, that embarrassing moment at Buckingham Palace had ended up helping both of them become better people. Margaret felt tears in her eyes as she listened to her daughter. She realized that her mistake and her response to it had created ripples that extended far beyond herself. By being willing to be vulnerable and honest about her flaws, she had given Emily permission to do the same. By changing herself, she had opened the door for their relationship to change as well. It was not perfect yet, and probably never would be, but it was real and growing in ways that mattered. As Emily prepared to leave the next day, she hugged her mother tightly and told her she loved her. Margaret held on for a long moment, memorizing the feeling. Emily promised to come back for Christmas and said she wanted to bring Alex to meet her mother. Margaret said she would love that, and she meant it. Not because it would look good or provide content for social media, but because she genuinely wanted to know the people who were important to her daughter. After Emily left, Margaret sat in her apartment, which she had slowly been making more personal and warm over the past months. She thought about the journey she had been on since that mortifying day in London. She thought about the guard whose firm response had shaken her out of her complacency. She thought about all the people who had shown her kindness or taught her lessons along the way. She opened her laptop and began writing, not for social media, but for herself. She wrote about what she had learned about respect and humility. She wrote about the difference between confidence and arrogance, between self-promotion and authentic self-expression. She wrote about how sometimes the most embarrassing moments of our lives can become the most transformative, if we are willing to face them honestly. She wrote about how that royal guard, just doing his duty to maintain order and dignity, had inadvertently given her a gift. His sharp rebuke and the public humiliation that followed had been exactly what she needed, though she could never have admitted it at the time. He had held up a mirror and forced her to see herself clearly. That moment of being put in her place had been the beginning of finding her actual place in the world, not as someone above others, but as someone connected to them. Margaret saved.